Yep, time for part 6 of Diana Palmer Unleashed. And we're starting at page 204. We're going to work our way to that little white thing, and then I'll have to find some more pages for us to share tomorrow night. So take a deep seat. Clancy was going to tell Banks about her phone call of the night before to ask him what to do next, but circumstances put an end to that. Banks came in on time, but he wasn't alone. He had Grace with him. He was almost glowing. She agreed to let him take her down to the ranch. He'd taken a day off, a very unusual thing for him to do it. He was smiling as Grace paused in the office. "Hi, Clancy," Grace said with a smile. "You look very nice." Clancy flushed. She was wearing an old jeans with a blue check cotton shirt, buttoned all the way with a long sweater vest worn over it. "Thanks. I don't approve of the way most young women dress these days. Honestly, it's as if they were advertising everything they've got." Banks was too happy to bristle at Grace's unexpected riposte at his sister Brenda. "Got that weapon and the permit with you?" he asked Clancy. She nodded. "They're in my purse. Keep that gun close." Page 205. She started to tell him about her phone call, but he was quite obviously impatient to leave. You're giving her a gun?" Grace asked, aghast. "What are you thinking, Colt?" He gave her a long, steady look. "Sorry, that's privileged information and I just can't share it." Grace just stared at him. Clancy stared at him too. Confused, he ignored both of their speculative glances. "Come on, Grace, it's not a long drive," he added when he saw her looking at her watch. "I hope not. I have a meeting with one of the mission elders in 2 hours." "I'll have you back before then," he promised. His heart sank. She hardly had any time to spend with him. Well, there was always tomorrow, he told himself. He glanced at Clancy. "If anyone calls who can't get me, take down the name and number and say I'll get back to them tomorrow. Okay?" "Okay, Mr. Banks," she said with a big grin. He hated having her address him so formally. He frowned, wondering why. Grace put her hand around his arm and smiled at him, and he forgot everything. "I won't be back in today," he added. "No problem," Clancy replied. "Have a good time." "We're going to go see a ranch where they slaughter poor calves," Grace sighed. "I'm afraid it isn't my idea of a good time at all." "I love cattle," replied it with a smile. Clancy, "I wish I lived in a place where I could have some. I'd have 2 milk cows so that I would always afford milk." And that's page 205. 206. "It's cruel to milk them," Grace said sadly. "It oppresses them." "Excuse me," Clancy said carnestily, "but have you ever seen a cow who hasn't been milked? They actually cry because the pain is so bad. Sometimes a calf can't take all the milk. If they're beef cattle, you can't milk them because it's too dangerous. But if they're dairy cattle or a cow you can keep for milk, you can. It's a lot crueler not to milk them. Honest." "How would you know that?" Grace said in not so truly friendly way. "My ex-boss has cattle ranch in Jacobs County," Clancy said, "and he keeps 2 milk cows." Grace just stared at her without speaking. "We better go," Banks said shortly. He tugged Grace along with him. "I'll be here in the morning, and if there's anything urgent you can text me." Before she could tell him that she didn't know his cell phone number, he was up the steps and gone. Clancy hoped the number was somewhere accessible because if an emergency did come up, she'd have to be able to contact him. It shocked her that she hadn't even asked for it before. He always called in, and when he was out of the office, so she'd never have to track him down. Yet at least, then she remembered, even if she didn't have his cell phone number, Cal would have it. She could call him for the number or for help if she needed it. She sat down at her desk with a long sigh. It looked as if Banks was head over heels in love with Grace. She didn't blame him. He'd known her for a long time, cared for her a long time, been alone for a long time. She wanted him to be happy. He'd been kind to her and to Tad. This is page 207. It was sad that Grace had such a bad opinion of guns and cattle, but then she was really religious, and it made some sense that she had some firm attitudes. Clancy was religious too, but she was not rigid in her beliefs. She simply thought that the way people chose to live their lives between them and God, and it wasn't her place to judge them. She went back to work, hoping that the daily routine would help keep Morris out of her thoughts, even temporarily. And that was page 206 and 207, and here comes 208. He dropped Grace off at her church and left her with a smile. She gave him one too, an impersonal one that she might have given a stranger. He hadn't even planned to, but he stopped by the office. Clancy was having a quick lunch at her desk. While she keyed old files into the computer, she looked up, surprised, when he came down the steps. He scowled. "What the hell are you eating?" he asked shortly. "Grits," she said. "Why?" He made a terrible face. "Grits for lunch?" "I like grits," she said. "And just what have you got against corn?" "They make grits out of corn," he returned. "Well, you're in a sweet mood today," she muttered as she scraped out the last little bit of grits and spooned it into her mouth. "The cattle being oppressed has soured me," he retorted. She looked up, curious. "What sort of cattle do you have?" she wondered. "Santa Gutes." She smiled. "I like them. Cal runs black Baldies, just beef cattle, but Cy Parks has purebred Santa Gutes, and they're famous all over the world." He scowled. "And how would you know that?" "He and Cal are friends. Cal took Tad with me, and one Saturday when he had to talk to Mr. Parks about something, and Harley Fowler took us on a tour of the place while Cal was busy. It was fascinating. I didn't even know that the foundation herd of the Santa Gertrudis was at the King Ranch up in Kingsville." He was staring at her. It was actually painful to compare her attitude about cattle with Grace's. "Do you have a lot of them?" she asked. "Only about 100 head." "Wow, that's a lot. Are they purebreds?" He smiled. "Yeah." She put her refuse in the trash and sipped her coffee. "I made coffee if you want some," she said. She frowned. "I thought you were taking the day off." "I was. Grace had to be back for a meeting, so I thought I'd go get the gun by the gun store, pick up that .28 gauge shotgun I ordered." "That's a lightweight gun." He looked exasperated. "And how would you know that?" That was page 208, 209. Oh, and my hair's getting in the way. 210. "Granddaddy was a AAA skeet shooter," she said. "I used to go to the gun club with him to watch him practice." She made a face. "He could shoot all 4 classes of shotgun, even an antique Colt .45 he owned, but he wouldn't let me use anything except a .28 gauge." He scowled. "You can shoot a shotgun?" he asked. "Well, it's not that hard," she began defensively. "I found a very few women who would even pick one up," he returned, "and that includes my sister. They're afraid of getting the kick and the noise. Granddaddy had put padded stock on mine. It was to lessen the impact of the kick, and we always had wore earplugs on the range, and I really enjoyed it. Shooting, I mean." She loved guns and cattle, and Grace thought both were unacceptable. He'd never been so depressed. It showed, too. "Do you still have his guns?" he asked after a minute. She shook her head. "Ben sold every one of them," she said tautly, "to help pay for Morris's lawyer." She frowned. "Well, all but the .45 double-action Colt," she admitted, "and that went missing just after Granddaddy disappeared. We never found it. Ben was really mad about that because it was in a hand-tooled, very old gun belt that belonged to my great-great-grandfather. The pistol was an antique as well. It was worth a lot of money." "You think Morris took it?" he speculated. She drew in a breath. "I'm not sure, but he probably did. Morris was an addict. He would have sold it if it would have made him enough more money for drugs. And if he did have it, it certainly wasn't going to tell his father." He studied her for longer than he meant to. She was pretty, and he liked the way she dressed, the way she smiled, and he liked a lot of things about her. "Have you heard from Morris?" he asked abruptly. She nodded. His face hardened. "When?" She drew in a steadying breath. The question was painful. "He called me last night on my cell phone," she said miserably. "Why didn't you tell me this morning?" She gave him a long, suffering look. "You were in a hurry this morning," she replied. He grimaced. "I guess I was. What did he say?" "That he was going to pay me back for sending him to jail, that he had no plans to go back, no matter what. He made threats about Tad as well." Banks moved closer to the desk. "He'll never get Tad," he said. She nodded. "Cal has people watching him. A couple of them are ex-MERS. We have people in law enforcement who can do that," he returned, irritated. Her eyebrows went up. "On our budget?" she exclaimed. "Well, we could probably afford a guy off the street who'd be willing to work for pizza and beer." Her eyebrows went up. "On our budget?" Okay, we did that one already. "And if he's after you, I'll guarantee he's after Darrell Tarley as well." He continued. "Have you told Hollister?" "Not yet." "You call him right now," he added curtly. He turned on his heel. She started to ask where he was going, and then realized that it was his day off, and she bit her tongue. This is page 210 to 11. 212. He stopped at the steps and turned back with a scowl. "You're alone down here," he said abruptly. "No kidding," she said with mock surprise. "I'll tell the guy hidden in the closet to go home then." He gave her a dour look. "I'm serious. We can't lock you in. I don't like you being alone down here by yourself." "I could go work in the lieutenant's office, but who would man the phones here?" she wanted to know. He was disturbed. Moore's Duffy was vindictive, and he had contacts in the criminal community. What he could do to the sweet, kind girl sitting there was unthinkable. Banks felt his heart jump at the thought of Clancy lying dead on the floor in her own office. "I've got the pistol," she said, because he looked so concerned. "It's loaded, and I know how to use it. Cal took me on the firing range a lot. Before that, Granddaddy taught me how to handle all sorts of weapons, and I'm not helpless." He looked worried. His black eyes narrowed on her. "I've gotten used to you," he said gruffly. She stared at him. "Imagine that, when you were trying to send me back to work for Cal just a few months ago." The mention of her former boss made him angry, but he kept it from showing. "Nobody's taking you out of my watch," he said shortly. "Not you or Tad." She was genuinely touched by his concern. She smiled. "Thanks, Mr. Banks." So formal, it set him off even more. "You're welcome, Nasturism," he added with a hint of his old sarcasm. "I am not a Nasturism." "A very likely story," he huffed. He started up the steps. "I'll work this out, one way or the other," he murmured to himself as he left. Page 213. She sat there thinking about him after he left. She didn't want to. He was involved with another woman, a saintly woman at that. Clancy was just a minor irritation into his busy work. Besides all that, her life was so complicated, there was no room for a man. Moore's worried her, not for herself, but for Tad. She knew that despite all the precautions she'd taken, Moore's had friends who could ferret out information for him. If he had Tad, Clancy would do anything to save him, even trade her own life for the child's. She hoped it wouldn't come to that, but Moore's had been very firm about not going back to prison. If only they could connect him to her grandfather's disappearance. If they could only probably lock him up for 20 years or so, long enough for Tad to grow into a man at least. She studied her short, neat fingernails and then thought with real longing of the guitar. She remembered Cal's invitation to Thanksgiving dinner. It was only a week or two away, and it would be nice for a big meal, that the sort Clancy and Tad couldn't really afford these days. Of course they would go. They just had to make sure Cal picked them up at Tad's after-school program instead of the shelter. He'd be furious at the thought of them living there. But she didn't want to make Cal's responsible for them. He needed to get married again to a good woman and have children while he was still relatively young. She wanted to tell him that, but she didn't dare. She went back to work, forcing her fears to the back of her mind. One step at a time, one day at a time, she told herself. Worrying was a one-way street to despair. She had to keep moving and stop brooding. Everything would be all right, she told herself. That was page 212, 213. Here's 214. Except that, just before it was time to pick up Tad at school, she had an unexpected call. "Where's your little brother?" a familiar voice drawled. Her heart skipped wildly. "He's at school," she said doggedly, "and they have standing orders not to let him leave with anyone except me." "Anyone except you and Hollister," he chuckled. He sounded high as a kite. She wondered if he was. "I told them Hollister sent me to get the boy because he was at a crime scene. Must have been a new woman, because she just smiled and said okay." Her heart stopped beating. "I told Tad to scream if anyone tried to take him," she said frantically. "I told him what I'd do to you if he did," he said with an unsteady laugh. "He thought I had you locked in a bedroom at home. So now, what are you going to do, little tattletale?" he asked in a cold, angry voice. Her mind was racing. Her heart was racing. She gripped the phone. "I'll come over there. You can trade Tad for me. I won't even make a fuss," she said, trying to think about what Morse might do to her. "Please." "I'll think about it and let you know," he said. "Don't hurt him," she burst out. "Well, that depends on you, doesn't it?" he asked, slurring his words, and hung up. She was shivering in fear. It was quitting time, and Morse had Tad. What would she do? Her first instinct was to call Cal, and she did. But amazingly, what Morse had told her, though, was the truth. Cal actually was at a crime scene, and the switchboard said he wasn't answering his phone. Banks might have helped had he been in the office, but he was gone, and she didn't know where to find him. There was nobody else. So she sweated and felt sick all over, and contemplated what Morse might be doing to her little brother. She could call the police, but Morris could say the boy wasn't there and refuse a search unless the police had a warrant. By the time they got one, he'd have Tad somewhere else. Tears of impotent fury ran down her pale cheeks. She had to do something. She just couldn't sit in her office and hope Morris would suddenly come to his senses and let the boy go. Kidnapping was a federal offense. He'd go up for life if they caught him at it. She could call the FBI, but Morris would just hide Tad or make him disappear as her grandfather had disappeared. He already mentioned that. She put on her face in his hands and wiped away the tears. Her mind refused to think. She was devastated. While she was cursing her own fate, her cell phone went off. She fumbled it to her ear. "Morris?" she asked at once. "Sis?" It was Tad. "Oh, my God. Are you all right? Has he got you? Has he hurt you?" She burst out into frantic. "He and his friends are stoned," he said, his voice a little shaky. "I opened the window in the room. Morris locked me in. I had a cell phone in my pocket, so I called that cab driver who's always so nice. He was bringing me to your office. You still there?" "Oh, yes," she sobbed. "Oh, yes, I am, Tad. Oh, yes." "We're almost there, sis. Don't cry. I'm really okay." 2:14, 2:15, here comes 2:16. She swallowed down a dozen fears. "All right, I'll be waiting when you get here. It's quitting time anyway. The cab can take us on to the shelter, right?" She didn't argue. She had just enough to pay him with a tip and a little of her check that would be left over for food. "Yes, he can," she said softly. "Oh, yes." She locked up the shaking hands, thanking God over and over for the returning of her brother. The cab pulled to the sidewalk. Tad opened the door and she almost dragged him out and hugged him until she embarrassed him. "Sorry," she said, but she let him go. "Muscle spasm." He smiled gently. "If you say so." She looked him over critically. He had a couple of bruises which made her angry, but he was otherwise unharmed apparently. "Okay, let's go home." She climbed in the cab and thanked the driver profusely for picking him up so quickly. "It was nothing," he said easily. "He's a good kid. Where are you going?" she told him. He grimaced. "Such a sad place. These apartments are all over town." "Apartments cost money," she said with a smile and a sigh. "We're poor." His face taunted. "As so many of us are," he agreed quietly. "It's not so bad," she said, ruffling Tad's hair affectionately. "We have family. That's worth more than gold." "You are very wise," the cab driver said with a smile. "Very wise indeed." He dropped them off at the shelter. She paid him and rushed Tad inside, building up to their room. She locked it and leaned back against the door with a long, heavy sigh. "I thought he might kill you," she said miserably. "Me too," he confessed. "But all he did was lock me in Ben's old bedroom. He just forgot to lock the windows," he added. He hugged her for comfort, and it had been a scary experience. "I heard him stumbling around the hall talking to one of his friends." "Could you hear what he said?" "He was bragging about how smart he was. He said he killed a man with an old gun that wasn't even registered, and nobody would ever know where it was." He grimaced. "I think he meant Granddaddy Clancy." Her heart stopped and then started again. "Did he say anything else?" "Just that he was going to make you pay for putting in prison. He said that you would never see me again. That didn't work out the way he planned." He drew a breath. "I'm just glad he didn't lock that window. I was so scared." She gathered him close. "I tried to trade you myself for you. I would have done anything to save you." He hugged her back. "Me too," he said. "He was so high he didn't even know where he was half the time. He put a good act on for Ms. Marvin at school, and she didn't even know him. She was so sweet. She believed what he said about Cal sending him to pick me up, and he looked so cold and sober when he said it. Mrs. Marvin is new and didn't know any better. I was afraid to say anything. Miss Morris gave me that look that he used to have when he got in the cab, and he said he already had you." Page 216, 217, here comes 218. "I didn't dare try to get away." Then he paused. "Poor Mrs. Marvin. She's nice. I hope they don't fire her," he said worriedly. She didn't echo his sentiments. Tad could have died because a new worker didn't catch out the man who claimed that he was a friend of Cal's. She swallowed hard. "I've never been so scared, not since that night," she confessed him brokenly. "I'm okay," he repeated. He drew back and looked up at her. "But if he could find me at school, he could find me here. What are we going to do? He's going to be really mad because I got away, you know. Even when he's not using drugs. I do indeed." She let him go and paced while she tried to think of ways and means to save them. She paused and looked at her little brother, the light of her life. "I'll find a way, I promise." Okay. Page 220. He went by the office at the Brandiff Apartments and asked for Clancy and Tad's room number. The manager looked at him curiously. "Who?" he asked. "Clancy Lang. She has a little brother living with her. He's 9. He frowned. "We don't have any Langs here." He he said. There's a Carly Lang, but she's in her 50s. Banks felt his face go taut. Are you sure? He nodded. I've been manager here for 16 years, he said. I know everybody, and I mean everybody who lives here. Sorry, I can't help you. Thanks just the same, Banks said. He forced a smile and went back out to his vehicle. He called Hollister. She's not here, he said tautly. She never was here. Where are you? Cal asked. The Brandif Apartments, he said curtly. Something's going on and it doesn't feel right. No, it doesn't. Okay. Cal said after a minute. Let's logic this out. She's within walking distance of your office and Tad's school. The Brandif's apartments are low-rent housing within a 3-mile radius, I know. I've been trying to help her find a place she could afford. If she couldn't afford the Brandif, there's only one place that she's left likely living. Banks took a deep breath. The homeless shelter, he said icily. Exactly, Cal replied, and when you find her, you give her hell for me too, because I offered her twice to bring them down here until I could find her a place in town. I'll give her both barrels, Banks promised. And then call me so I can be sure she's all right, he added quietly. I'll do that too. He drove to the homeless shelter. He knew it was because he had to do an interview with a reluctant witness just there 2 weeks earlier. He asked for Clancy by name, page 220, 221, and was given permission to go to her room. After showing his credentials and mentioning that she worked for him, he knocked on the door and waited patiently. There were footsteps. The door was unlocked and open, and Clancy stood there in sweatpants and a thick t-shirt and her mouth open, gaping at him. Banks was the last person on earth she had expected to find at her door. She couldn't even find words. He didn't even seem angry. His dark eyes weren't exactly friendly, though. Well, he asked, can I come in? That was 222, 223. Oh, she opened the door reluctantly and let him inside. Her phone was ringing again. She knew it was Cal. She hadn't answered it out of fear that he found out what happened earlier. Now that Banks had found her, she had another hint about why Cal was calling. She wasn't wearing shoes. She seemed even shorter, more fragile to Banks, who's still wearing his boots with 2-inch roping heels on them. He looked down at her coolly. You lied, he said curtly. She bit her lower lip. She felt sick all over. She drew in a quick breath and started to speak. Tad came out of his room and saw Banks and actually ran to him. Banks went on one knee to meet the charge and picked the child up. Page 224 and 225. I was so scared, he sobbed into the big man's chest. He'd been so upset ever since they got to the shelter. He put on an act for Clancy with the cab driver, but when they got home, it was all caught up with him. He'd been crying on and off ever since. Banks hugged him. He felt odd. It was really first time in his life anybody except Brenda, and later Grace, had needed him. He rubbed the boy's back. Calm down now and tell me what happened. Morris took him from the after-school program, Clancy said miserably. There was a new woman. She didn't know that only Cal and I had permission to pick him up. Morris drove him home, locked him in a room, and called me to gloat. I tried to make a trade for him for myself, but Morris wouldn't. Tears choked her. I was afraid to call anybody. Morris sounded drugged up, and he's unpredictable. I thought if I called the police and they rushed the house that Tad would be the first to. Then how? Tad pulled back, rubbing his eyes. Morris was so high that he didn't take my cell phone away. He locked the room, but he forgot to lock the window, so I opened the window, called a cab driver who'd been nice to me and Sis, and then he took me to your office. We picked up Sis, and the cab driver brought us here. You're a brave kid, Banks said with visible admiration. Tad, actually flushed. I didn't feel brave. I was scared to death. Morris would catch me. Banks smiled gently, pulling out a handkerchief to mop up Tad's face. Everybody's afraid when they're under fire, he said softly. The definition of courage is doing what you need to do regardless of how afraid you are. And that was 224. Here comes 225. Tad drew in a shaky breath. Thanks, he winced. What are we going to do? He'll hurt us when he sobers up and finds me gone. No, he won't. Banks got to his feet and looked down at Clancy. Pack up your things. You're both coming home with me. Clancy flushed scarlet and searched for words. We're picking up my sister at her apartment on the way, he said in a long-suffering tone. Oh, she just stared at him. She would have argued, but he looked more formidable than usual, and she was too unnerved to marshal an argument. She's waiting for us, he prodded. Oh, sorry. She took Tad and with her to pack up a few personal items they brought with them, including Tad's school books. They dressed and went out of the living room with all their possessions. Banks looked at them with an ache in his heart. It was painful to see how little they had. Both of them had dark circles under their eyes. He could only imagine how afraid they both had been this afternoon. Well, Morris wasn't touching them ever again. "Let's go," he said gently. They went back down to the lobby. Banks had them wait for them while he talked with the woman in charge and explained what happened. She was very supportive. They could always come back any time they needed to, she added, smiling at Clancy and Tad. "Thanks for everything," Clancy said gently. She nodded. "You're very welcome." Here's page 226 and 227. Banks herded them out to the SUV, put them inside, and started towards his sister apartment. "Cal Hollister," he said curtly as he drove. "He's been out of his mind with worry." She grimaced. "I didn't answer when he called earlier." "Just do it." She glared at him. "You are very bossy," she said shortly. "Comes from years of ordering people around," he murmured. She sighed, opened up her phone, and called Cal. "Where the hell have you been?" he exploded. "At the homeless shelter," she said, wincing. "I'm so sorry." "I was worried sick. What happened?" She hesitated. "I'll tell you later," she said in a minute. "Mr. Banks is taking us home with him." "I know. His sister's going with you." "Yes, we're going to pick her up now," she added. "I had 2 men watching you. They got up a fight and they're in jail, but I'll find somebody else. You and Tad will be safe." "Morris kidnapped him," she blurted out. "What?" "He locked him in a room. Tad climbed out the window, called a cab on his cell phone. The cab driver brought him to me and then drove us both to the homeless shelter. I didn't know what to do." "You should have called me, or Banks, or the FBI." "Morris might have killed Tad when they rolled up to his front door," she said miserably. He relented. "We need to have a long talk when you feel like it." She managed a smile. "Okay." "I'm glad you both are safe," he added gently. "Thanks, so are we. I'll talk to you later." "You bet." She hung up. Banks glanced at her. "Furious, was he?" "A little worse than that," she said. "I should have called for help. I just panicked," she added. "It's okay, sis," Tad said. "We're safe now." "Yes," she glanced at the tall man beside her in the front seat. "We're safe." He glanced at her and felt his heart shift 10 degrees, tired, frightened, her hair ruffled, no makeup on, and she was the prettiest woman he ever seen. He made a sound deep in his throat and averted his eyes. He sent Brenda a text. "She's on her way down," he told his passengers. Brenda came out a few minutes later with a small carrier. "I'm bringing the kitten," she called. "You got a kitten?" Tad exclaimed. "Can we play with it?" She laughed. "Of course you can. I'll be right behind you on the way to Jacobsville. Don't run any more red lights," she cautioned her brother. He made a rude sound. She just laughed and climbed into her small foreign car with a cat carrier. "I do not run red lights," he told Clancy. "You don't?" "Never." That was page 226 and 227. Here's page 228, 229. "Okay," he glanced at her twinkling brown eyes. "Well, I did once. Brenda was with me. The city police caught up with us." He made a face. "I got a ticket, and she's never let me forget it." Clancy smothered a laugh. "Don't you do that," he cautioned, "or I'll bury you in old files when we get back to the office." "Tomorrow," she began. "Not tomorrow. Not you," he added. "You're staying at the ranch, and so is Tad. I'll go by his school, speak to the principal. Meanwhile, I'm going to speak with the FBI and the assistant DA, Darrell Tarley, and see how much trouble I can make for your stepbrother. He can't be allowed to get away with kidnapping a child." "It's Tad's word against Morris's," she said miserably. "It is not. I'll find a woman who gave him to Morris's custody." "Yes, but see, she gave him custody," she pointed out. "He didn't take Tad away without permission." "Graduated law school just recently, did you?" he drawled sarcastically. She glared at him. "You're just mad because you didn't think of it," she replied haughtily. Tad chuckled. "Okay, no petting the kitten for you," he said over his shoulder. "I'm sorry," Tad exclaimed. "Really?" Banks chuckled too. "Okay." It wasn't a long drive to the ranch. It set back off the highway on a long graveled road between fences and cross fences. The full moon gave Banks' passenger a much better view of the land than a dark night would have. The house was Victorian, 2 stories high, with towering trees all around it. There were several outbuildings and one which looked like a barn. "I love Victorian houses," Clancy said excitedly. "My grandparents used to live in one outside of Floresville." He chuckled. "This one has a history. I'll tell you it one day." He pulled up the steps, and there was a porch furnishing, including a swing. Clancy could only imagine how much fun it would be to sit out here on a lazy summer night. And we're here. He got Clancy and Tad out of it and carried their bags inside the house. Brenda pulled right behind Banks' SUV and cut off her engine. She picked up the cat carrier and bounded onto the porch with an overnight bag over her shoulder. Banks opened the door. There was a blur of red fur. He knelt down and picked up Miss Kitty. "Did you miss me, baby?" he teased, and she purred and rubbed her head against his chest. "She's so pretty," Clancy exclaimed. The cat looked at him with soft amber eyes. "Can I pet her?" Tad asked excitedly. "She's a little nervous of people, just at first," he began as he put the cat down, but she went right up to Tad and rubbed against him. "Well," Banks said, stunned, "and here's Bumblebee," Brenda added, opening the cat carrier. A little ball of fur trundled out of the cage, so fat and that her little sides bulged. She meowed softly. "Oh my goodness," Clancy exclaimed. And this is 228, 229, going on 230. She bent and picked up the little cat, rubbing her head against it. "What a sweet baby. She's just 2 months old," Brenda said. "Somebody found her walking across a parking lot, a shopping center, and we brought her into the vet for adoption." She grimaced. "We haven't found anybody yet. I'd love to take her, but I'm not allowed pets in my apartment." "We aren't allowed to have them in the shelter either," Clancy said sadly. "Shelter?" Brenda exclaimed, horrified. Clancy went scarlet red. "She wrote the book on pride," Banks huffed as he glanced at Clancy. His eyes went back to his sister. "Hollister offered her a temporary home, too. She had lied to both of us about having a nice apartment over the near office." He was glaring now at Clancy. "Don't be mean, Colt," Brenda chided as she slid an arm around Clancy's shoulders. "He isn't an old bear, really," she assured the other woman. "He just does a really dandy impression of one." He was glaring at both women now. "Miss Kitty likes me," Tad exclaimed, entranced with the big cat. Banks chuckled. "So it seems. Come on, let me show you to your rooms. This is a huge house. We have 3 extra bedrooms beside mine and the one Brenda uses when she comes down on weekends. You can choose whichever one you want." "Do you have one with a connecting door?" Clancy asked worriedly, with a speaking glance at Tad, who was still looking at the big cat on the floor. Banks understood at once. "Yes, there is one." He led upstairs and down the hall to a room that overlooked a long fenced pasture that was obviously a barn. It had twin beds with a simple chenille bedspread and a dresser. There was a closet, and in the bedroom beyond the open door was a larger bed with a quilt converting it in a bathroom. "It's nothing fancy," Banks began. "Oh, it's like a palace compared to our house," Clancy broke in gently. "These floors are oak, aren't they?" His eyebrows lifted. "Yes, made the old-fashioned way with long, thin strips." "Granddaddy's house had floors like this." She turned. "And I can't thank you enough," she said. "I don't know what we would have done. I wasn't sure that Morris wouldn't have tracked us down," and she stopped dead. "But we'll be both putting you out of danger if we stay here," she added with obvious worry. He pointed to the star on his white shirt. Brenda pointed to the star on his shirt. Clancy sighed. "Okay," she swallowed. "Thanks," she added huskily. "This is awesome," Tad exclaimed, running between the rooms. "Gosh, it's so big you could play baseball in here." "Don't you even think about it," Banks told him with twinkling black eyes. "It's okay. I don't even have a bat," he assured the tall man. "Do you got horses?" he added with bright eyes. "Lots of them," Banks said. "I'm off Saturday. I'll take you both riding." He glanced at his sister and laughed. "You can come too. I've got a nice new rocking horse." Page 230, 231, 232, 233. We're getting there. I see the white thing is not too far off. She glared at him. "If you put a saddle on it, I can ride it," she said huffily. "That's true," Banks had to admit. "She did barrel race in her teens." She laughed. "That was a while back. Can you ride?" she asked Clancy. Clancy nodded. "It's been a long time, but Granddaddy always had a couple of saddle horses on the ranch." Her face was sad. "He was a grand rider." Banks began to understand her. She loved her grandfather. It must have been a hell on her not knowing if he was alive or dead, even though he'd vanished 5 years earlier. "We'll find out the truth," he assured her, "one way or another." "Thanks," she said. "Do you like cartoons, Mr. Banks?" Tad asked hopefully. His eyebrows arched. "Why?" he asked. Tad flushed. "Saturday morning cartoons are like his whole life," Clancy teased. "Well, except for video games." She stopped and grimaced. They'd had to leave the equipment and the games at the house. They now belonged to Morris. Banks raised both dark eyebrows. "What sort of games do you like?" "Destiny 2, the boy said at once. Banks chuckled. "Why are you laughing?" Clancy wanted to know. "Put your stuff down and follow me." He led them downstairs to the living room and pointed to a console on the entertainment center below the big screen TV. Tad caught his breath. "It's an Xbox One," he burst out, "and you'll find Destiny 1 and 2 installed on it." He told Tad, "I don't have a lot of time to play, but it's one of my favorites." Tad's eyes grew wide with anticipation. "You can play as much as you like," Banks told him. "As long as your homework's done first," he added firmly. "I'll do my homework first thing every day, I swear," the boy promised solemnly. Clancy could have hugged the tall man for that. She knew how badly Tad had missed his games. But this was afraid to take anything out of the house in case she was afraid to take anything out of the house in case Morris knew the equipment had been there and accused his siblings of stealing it. He still had friends in the neighborhood, and Clancy couldn't be sure that Morris hadn't had somebody pick the lock and take a look around to see what was in the house. I wish they hadn't let Morris out, Tad said sadly. The law is the law, Clancy said, reminding him gently. You can't keep people locked out forever, not even Morris. I guess not. You'll both be safe here, Banks assured them. I have 2 full-time cowboys who live on the ranch. One of them, he added with a smile, is a former Texas Ranger. Brenda's face taunted. She didn't say a word, but Clancy recognized irritation when she saw it. He won't ever come near this house unless I ask him to, Banks assured her. And I won't ask him when you're home. Brenda didn't reply. She just stared at her brother. He did apologize, he added. Page 232, 233, 234. She made a huffy sound and started toward the kitchen. And I hope you got something to cook in here, she said, turning on the light. I didn't have time for supper. Freezer's full, Banks said, tossing his hat onto the hat rack. Don't you touch it, he added. Clancy and Tad stared at him. She can burn water, he said, giving his sister a glare. No way I'm turning her loose with my contents of the freezer. I can cook a steak, Brenda protested. Anybody can cook a steak. It has to be defrosted first. You can't use an auto defrost on the microwave, Clancy said gently. You don't own a microwave, so how do you know, Banks added. When Ben, my stepfather, was alive, we had one. I had to cook after Mama died. If I hadn't, we'd all have starved to death. Ben and Morris couldn't cook. You can cook? Brenda asked her, her eyes lit up. Banks glowered at her. I can cook too, he reminded her. You can cook steak and potatoes. I'm sick to death of steak and potatoes. It's steak and potatoes for breakfast, steak sandwiches for lunch, steak and potatoes for supper. Steak is good for you, and besides that, I've got 2 sides of beef in the freezer. That will go bad if we don't eat it. Chicken is very nice, Brenda began. I'd rather eat feathers, Banks shot back. Where's the freezer? Clancy asked. Brenda walked around her brother and led Clancy to it. It was less than an hour. Clancy had just made fresh biscuits and herb chicken, with mashed potatoes and seasoned green beans. Banks was almost moaning with pleasure as he ate. Brenda watched him covertly grinning at Clancy when he wasn't watching. Who taught you to cook? Brenda asked. My grandmother, she said with a smile. She was a wonderful cook. I have one of her cookbooks in the backpack I keep my things in, she grimaced. We don't have a lot of stuff left. Ben got really mad at us for testifying against Morris, so he threw out most of the things I had left for my grandparents. Banks grimaced. That's petty, he said harshly. That was Ben, she replied. He wasn't really a bad man. He just loved Morris more than anybody else. I don't remember him much, Tad said as he finished a mouthful of buttered biscuit. I remember Morris, though, he shivered. How old were you? Banks asked him. Almost 4, Sis said, he replied. I don't remember much else about when I was little, but I remember Morris hitting me. He has nightmares, Clancy said, without adding that she had them as well. I'm not surprised, Banks replied. He finished cleaning his plate and sat back to sip his coffee. Clancy, you're in a class of your own as a cook, he said flatly. You could open a restaurant. Oh, not me, she said, flushing. I love to cook, but there's lots of people who could cook better than I can. Not many, he countered. He smiled at her. Page 234, 235. And guess what? Here it is. She averted her eyes. Thanks, she said huskily. Brenda watched them both with a secret glee that she was careful not to let them see. That was page 236, and our stopping point for tonight. I will section off the book so I can share more with you tomorrow, hopefully. I hope to feel a little better. Allergies are getting down to me. Life is getting the best of me. But I'm trying to focus on the positives and not be negative, which is hard to do. Anyway, I hope you're keeping your social distance, wearing your mask, washing your hands. When you can't, I hope that you are using your hand sanitizer. God bless. See you again tomorrow. Stay tuned.